than are terrains of politics, that they can reproduce these backwards, like dated, problematic ideas. They can also challenge them, right? We can think about science fiction as a place to play with alternative worlds, to sort of trace out alternative histories, to see about possibilities of alternative futures, and that these are things that are struggled over. We can think about how media like, Black Panther comes to mind, right? Things that are become sociological sort of phenomena. People are excited to see finally representation. We can think about things like Gamergate. We can think about all these ways in which games and media become arenas in which our own world's politics and conflicts kind of play out.
I was just thinking a great example of the idea of building a world as a sandbox. I always think of Octavia Butler's Parables of the Talents and Parables of the Sowers as a really wonderful, pretty early examples of sci-fi or climate change science fiction. Worlds that are in the relatively near future, not like super futuristic, but in a world that is contending with climate change, right? And so these books are, I think, really excellent examples of, this process of saying, okay, well, I've created this world and now I have these characters and I'm going to kind of put these characters in this sandbox or this, model and just see what happens to them, see how this plays out. And she does some really cool things, looking at the breakdown of our, democracy and what that could look like, and how corporations might start to almost operate as these like feudal overlords, and in a sense, like having little fiefdoms and reproducing things like the company town model of labor. And even though she wasn't a social scientist in the sense that like we might be of getting our PhDs in it, she did an amazing job at researching these concepts and then using them to both inform the world that she built, but also imagine, how it would play out and what it would look like in this kind of alternative version of our world.
Yeah, so I think one of the vague impulses of critical world building is to just set up this conversation between the best of work going on in speculative fiction and social scientists, ecologists, people who are sort of thinking about the worlds we live in today and like what futures might be. I know one of our special issue papers by Dylan Harris, right? I think Gretchen mentioned this explicitly, kind of getting into this dialogue between sci-fi and climate change science and scientific communication, and sort of how do we imagine futures of potentially apocalyptic futures, but also what society might do in that context.
There was a lot there that I have like different things I want to pick out from. I want to start with this. So you were mentioning earlier the replication of structures like white supremacy often embedded in some of the built worlds that we see. Within that, whose stories get told more often? What are the ways, besides just the replication of white supremacy, in which world building is a reflection of some of the implicit understandings and politics that we contain within us?
I think about this all the time. I've been thinking about this, of course, so much more over the last year, but I have so many examples I can think of. I think to answer your first question, so many of the forms of speculative media that we might regard as quote unquote canon were written by, white men who are pretty affluent and who are American or English, and like when you think about all of the fantasy that I grew up reading, it all took place, or most of it took place in some kind of pseudo medieval England times kind of world. And like, it's been really lovely to start to see the work of people like Adiyami, the Children of Blood and Bone, that series, where it's, or Helen Oyeyami, who is more in like the magical realism kind of space. But, these are women of color who are thinking and creating these worlds that are not always, coming from this place of like the colonizer, like white, this kind of sanitized white, like settler colonial perspective. So I think that's one thing. Another, and I was just thinking about this the other day, actually, is I kind of had this realization that so much of the dystopian young adult fiction I grew up reading, I think really reproduces this ideology of the American individualist, that like nothing is more important than our freedom and our autonomy, right? And so you can see that in stuff like The Giver or Scott Westerfeld's Uglies series. But like these are all dystopian futures where everything seems okay, like everyone's taken care of, but your protagonist is someone who is like, something's not quite right. And it's always because everything is laid out for them. They aren't really given any choice in the matter. And so the main plot is them pushing back against this world, this society that has, you know, kind of given them a path to follow. And I think at the heart of it, there is this like ideological like belief that it is better to be free and, I don't know, starving, broken, hungry, like whatever, you know, than to have like a perfectly running society that is actually, you know, doesn't give you any freedom. And of course, inevitably, what you do find is that it's not a perfect society, that there are these like hidden, you know, terrible things going on under the surface of, you know, not just freedoms being removed, but, you know, maybe people having their minds wiped or people being killed who don't somehow like fit in with the, you know, prevailing idea of what is good. But, you know, I think that is maybe a slightly more subtle way that sometimes these, you know, and you can't necessarily say that like an individualist discourse or ideology is like inherently white supremacist or vice versa, but there, you know, there are definitely overlaps there, as you can see when you look at, if you go and look at some of the arguments for, you know, you can't make me wear my mask, like you're going against my it's this idea that it's my individual choice whether or not to wear a mask. So it is this kind of tension between an individualist versus a more collectivist perspective. And I think you see that play out in some of those examples.
I mean, I think the question of whose stories get told is a big one. And it's something we're kind of living through in a really exciting way right now, right? In which we've seen challenges to the sort of same old of a bunch of white guys, and I say this as a white guy, but these stories that are kind of, you know, even on their own terms, sort of stale, right? I think one of the really exciting things with the growing popularity of like Dungeons and Dragons, right, with its most recent edition, and more broadly, right, just sort of geek culture being sort of valorized again, and the internet has facilitated a lot of that, of course, too, is that we're seeing, you know, openings for better, different, more interesting kind of stories and settings that often are created by ordinary folks, right? This isn't necessarily companies going to sort of saying, hey, buy this thing, right? Often we see, you know, in the rash of like sequeldom in media these days, just sort of replaying old things that are known sort of entities. But creators around the world, like coming up with new settings, drawing on, you know, these are sort of indie game producers, these kind of things, right? Drawing on African histories and folklores, or indigenous creators creating games and movies and telling different stories that bring in a lot more interesting stuff, create new questions, right? I think that's a real great time for that kind of thing. And it's also a time of contestation, right? Going back to Dungeons and Dragons, I think about how much there is a sort of like queer formulation of a lot of this stuff, right? In which you have the kind of mainstream D&D, and then you have this entire like queer fantasy subculture that is just like going to town, rethinking tieflings and like all kinds of stuff. And it's wonderful and it's wild and it's just fantastic. So I think what we're seeing in some ways, you know, yes, media reflects and can have kind of implicit reproduction of a lot of problematic stuff, but it can also, when opened up, democratized even, be a place of play and creation and alternatives. And I think part of what we're thinking with critical world building is really this idea of reflexivity, right? Think about what ideas are being reproduced through the media you're producing and consuming. Not like you can't have problematic faves. That's just part of being human. But we want to open that conversation.
Yeah, if I can add to this. So I'm also racialized as white, but I'm also socialized as a woman. And I think that in line with what Jeff was saying, as well, like whose stories are being told. But I think it even goes beyond that. It's like who's telling the stories as well as who is consuming those stories and thinking about the context in which all of these different processes are happening. The production of worlds as well as the consumption of worlds and kind of all of the different processes that goes through. And one example I think of to get to the critical reflexivity piece as well is, a famous example of maybe a problematic canon figure would be like Lovecraft, who is well known to be to have been extremely sexist and extremely xenophobic and extremely racist. And you really see this stuff come out in a lot of his work, but you're like, oh, but like, it's just such cool work in certain ways if you could. And so it becomes these questions of like, how do you even like that's a broader question. Like, what do you do if an artist is a problematic person? And you're like, what does this mean for their art? And there have been some recent examples where people are rewriting Lovecraft. And I have actually two examples next to me that I think are really lovely. One is called Winter Tide by Ruthana Emrys, and the other is called The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow by Kij Johnson. And I hope I'm not mispronouncing either of those names, but they're both examples of women who went in and rewrote Lovecraft, not like taking one of his stories, but they were taking his universe as the sandbox, which is a metaphor I have used before and I'm, continuing to use. And they're able to think about it like The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow is the story of a woman in this world who is deliberately trying to pull out these stories of women who, aren't written about in his writing, like they're just erased. And so she, thinks about, well, what would, someone who is socialized as a woman, how would that have fit into this universe? And I think Winter Tide is a really lovely example of addressing not just the side of gender and but also, the xenophobia, and it's more through the lens of like World War II and Japanese internment camps. And they're both really lovely examples of exactly what Jeff was talking about, which is people who are, taking existing quote unquote problematic faves and, trying to engage with them reflexively and critically to create new, more exciting, and hopefully more inclusive examples that offer up new opportunities for further engagement.
I mean, just on the Lovecraft, also want to pitch a Lovecraft country. Watchmen reinterpreting these stories as or through kind of Black stories and Black histories, I think is a really fantastic and interesting phenomenon we've been seeing a bit of lately that, again, like reinterprets, plays with, tells different stories, and in so doing, right, creates openings for thinking about our own history.
So I want to go back to that idea that Gretchen was just mentioning of built worlds as a sandbox. But before we do that, now is a great time for a quick break. We'll be right back.
Civic Tech 101 interviews individuals working in the public and nonprofit sectors to understand how technology is being applied to social problems, for better or worse. From analyzing open data to applying algorithms, we cover approaches and projects that are having a significant effect on how the nonprofit and public sectors function. Our interviewees explain the benefits of their work, the limitations of technology, and how to get involved. From publishing open data to combating disinformation, we talk with people who use data to help others, always distilling actionable information from complex ideas. If you're interested in the civic tech space and want to learn more about the current initiatives, then keep listening. We'll connect you with the key ideas that you need to know.
And we're back with Dr. Jeff Martin and Dr. Gretchen Sneegas. So earlier, you were mentioning the idea of built worlds as a sandbox, sort of as a form of, I'm going to call it imaginative experimentation. Would you characterize world building as an exercise in contemplating sort of the what ifs and the why nots of imagination? Or is this even a reasonable dichotomy?
I think that, well, first of all, I think of dichotomies as kind of a good first step for thinking about